everyone. Welcome to this event on decoding digital democracy in Africa. Thank you for joining us, and wherever you are, I hope you're safe. My name is Toussaint Notias. I'm the Associate Director of Research at the Digital Civil Society Lab at Stanford University. And today I'm really delighted to be here with a stellar group of speakers as we celebrate the launch of the Decoding Digital Democracy in Africa booklet. This compiled collection is the result of a collaboration between Democracy in Africa and the Digital Civil Society Lab. Democracy in Africa is a website dedicated to building bridges between academics, policymakers, practitioners, and citizens interested in African politics. The Digital Civil Society Lab is a research initiative of the Stanford Center on Philanthropy and Civil Society. Our goal is to understand and inform civil society in a digitally dependent world. So the booklet, Decoding Digital Democracy in Africa, contains 20 essays bringing varied perspectives from across the continent on a range of key issues related to digitization and politics. These essays were expertly compiled and edited by Lisa Garbe from St. Gallen and Nick Cheeseman from Birmingham University, and I'd like to thank them really, really deeply for their tireless work on this and making it happen in the event, and also to thank our speakers today who each contributed to the collection. You can download the booklet freely from the Democracy in Africa and Digital Civil Society website. I'll put a link in the chat soon. We encourage you to read it, to share it on social media. There's a data light version to share on sort of in context where connectivity is expensive, and also to join the DebateGI's social media. A lot of the contributors, you can find them online, especially on Twitter. We have an engaging and lively session planned today. Lisa Garbe will get started with a quick intro about the collection and our panelists. We'll hear from the speakers, and then our respondents will lead the conversation among the group. And we'll have 30 minutes at the end for Q&A. Please feel free to put your questions through the Q&A function of Zoom at any time during the talk, and we'll get to them at the end. Before I hand it over to Lisa, we have a little poll that we wanted to try to conduct with people attending today, and we'll come back to the results at the end of the event. So I'm going to launch the poll now, and people should be able to see it in the polling function. If someone can send me a chat message to let me know if you can see it. Okay, I see people voting, excellent. So the question that we've put to you today is, what is the most challenging feature of digitization for African politics and society? The options that we put here are the spread of fake news and hate speech, the cost and affordability of internet access, censorship and the blocking of internet access, dominance of multinational firms such as Facebook, the impact of artificial intelligence on the work and governance, growing surveillance and breaches of privacy, and finally, the lack of data regulation. We have about 40% of the people who voted. I think I will leave the poll open and hand the floor over to Lisa, who can take us into the introduction while people finish to vote.
Thank you, Toussaint, and hi, everyone. My name is Lisa Garbe, and I'm a political science researcher based at the University of St. Gallen. And I think I met Nick 1.5 years ago, and after some discussions, we thought it would be great to bring together different scholarly perspectives on the chances and risks associated with digitalization in African countries, and also to provide sort of an overview of the research and policy work that's currently done in this field. Now, as Toussaint already said, the result of this effort is a collection of about 20 short research and opinion pieces that you can now download in PDF format from the Democracy in Africa website. And I think this collection really offers a great overview of different aspects of digitalization in Africa and its implications for social and political developments, ranging from the opportunities that social media can provide for political or civic engagement to the risks that are, for instance, come along with Western tech companies getting involved in moderating African countries. And now I'm really happy that we managed to bring together 4 of the researchers who contributed to the series and who are now going to share some of their opinions and findings on those digital developments in Africa that they consider as particularly relevant. Now, in the order of the speakers, I would like to introduce you to them very briefly. That goes without saying that their biographies are much longer than my one-sentence bio that I'm now sharing with you. So first of all, I would like to welcome Nanjala Nyabola, who is an independent writer and researcher based in Nairobi. Second, I would like to welcome Bruce Mutsvairo, who is a professor at the School of Communication and Journalism at Auburn University. Third, I would like to welcome Julie Owono, who is the Executive Director of Internet Without Borders and also a member of Facebook's Oversight Board. And last but not least, I would like to welcome Herman Wasserman, who is a Professor of Media Studies at the University of Cape Town. And now first, I'm happy to give the floor to Nanjala, from whom we will hear first about her opinion on what trends we should really focus on when discussing digitalization in Africa. And as Nick already said in the beginning, please feel free to share your questions with us at any time, and please use the Q&A function. Thank you, Nanjala.
Hi, everyone. Good evening from Nairobi. I only have 5 minutes, so I'm just going to jump right into it. I don't know if this is so much a trend as it is a reminder of something that I think sometimes gets lost in the conversation, which is that it's a conversation, governance, governments, it's a conversation between those who govern and those who are governed. It's a conversation between power and the citizens. And I think what we're entering now is a stage where, as I mentioned in my first book, power is learning and power is adapting. For the longest time, the digital space was somewhat of an open frontier for organizing and activism. But now we're entering a situation where power is learning and power is adapting, and it's becoming a new frontier in which power can exert itself and can make use of what exists on the digital in order to make itself felt. We're seeing, for example, 3 things I want to point out: an increase in coordinated inauthentic behavior. We're seeing governments investing significant amounts of money, time, and energy into bots. These are designed to stifle criticisms, to drown out criticism, to hijack hashtags, to hijack conversations, and to tilt them towards government preferred positions. So, for example, I was just reading today that Facebook has had a lot of takedowns, about 87,000 posts taken down relating to Ethiopia, which reflect inauthentic behavior by accounts that are affiliated to the government, the National Security Agency. We've seen this also in Nigeria when we had the NSARS movement. Rwanda is notorious for using the internet in this way. And I think we're going to see more and more governments investing in using bots, in using shadow accounts, in using paid influencers to shift conversations away from protest and away from resistance. At the same time, I think we're going to see a lot of the companies struggling with this new reality, because unlike in the United States or in Europe, where there is a much clearer sort of the relationship between the corporations and the state is defined by a very old, if you would, regulatory regime like corporations. There's a lot more capacity for the legislature to exert itself on the companies. We are talking about situations whereby the legislative architecture is just being built. Kenya just getting its data protection law in 2020, a lot of countries not having these laws in place. And so I think the companies are going to stumble, and I think there's going to be a lot of feeling around in the dark, and I think there's going to be a lot of mistakes. I mentioned the End SARS movement. That was one instance where we saw a lot of protesters in Nigeria saying, our posts are being taken down. There seemed to be an arbitrary takedown of posts from protesters, of posts from people who were demanding accountability for police brutality in Nigeria. We've seen the same pattern replicated in Palestine. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that, because I think the companies are in a position now where they have to define a political position relative to an authoritarian regime that leaves them in a comfortable position, because the same authoritarian regime is the one that makes the laws. That's one thing. And tied to that, I think, is the second thing, which is the regulatory pushback. I think we're going to see much more of a regulatory pushback, either through the use of law or through the arbitrary shutdowns. Already this year, we saw Tanzania had Facebook, Twitter switched off for almost 8 weeks. Uganda had Facebook, Twitter, social networking switched off for a number of weeks around the election. Nigeria had Twitter switched off for about a week and a half, 2 weeks. And all of this we're going to see a lot more of this, I think, as governments start to deliberately crack down on the social networking platforms rather than wholesale shutdowns of the internet, which are inefficient and counterproductive, especially when you're trying to move towards more e-government and you're trying to get more people to use services like mobile money, the internet to pay taxes and things like that. So I think we're going to see a few more of these targeted shutdowns at fraught periods, elections, protests, and I think that for the social networking sites, it's going to be a challenge to define what their position is going to be relative to that. And tied to this is the idea of localization. I think we're going to see much more of a push for there to be someone in the country that can be sued, someone in the country that can be dragged before the president and told, why are you letting people do this to us? Why are you letting these people call us names? Why are you letting these people pick on us? And I'm curious to see how the companies are going to respond to that. And finally, more deliberate crackdowns against specific people, more deliberate crackdowns against people who are posting things and saying things that governments aren't comfortable with. In Kenya, the government is creating laws that are deliberately designed for this. As I've mentioned in many other forums, every single law that has been passed to regulate online behavior in Kenya is first used against critics of the state. The first people who are arrested are people who are blogging, people who are tweeting, people who are saying things. And usually there is a court saying this is an unjust use of the law, this is an unjust use of the law, or there being public mobilization for the release. But I think that, if you look at how, again, the internet no longer being this frontier of people feeling a measure of safety, feeling a measure of freedom to be able to criticize, I think we're going to see a lot more Jawar Mohammeds, going to see a lot of people singled out as examples of what the government can do on the internet as a way of kind of pushing back against that free-for-all energy that has been there in the early days. Now, I mean, all of this sounds very depressing, but I think what it is a reminder to activists, organizers, people who are working in human rights, people who are interested in really protecting the internet as an extension of the public sphere, as a place for political engagement and a place for public discourse. It's a reminder that power learns and power adapts, and you have to stay 2 steps ahead of power, and you have to keep adapting and learning as well. And I think it's an invitation for greater coordination, for support, and for even thinking about, well, what's the next social networking 5.0? We are right now at 4.0. What does 5.0 look like in such a way that it protects the rights and the interests of citizens, of individuals before power? And yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Nanjala. I guess I'm taking over from you. Right, I'm just going to try and raise both the bad and the good in my presentation. For Africans lucky enough to be digitally connected, communicating with each other has become easy, making the internet a community of its own, with booming culture of cognizance based on shared beliefs, attitudes, and desires. But increased online engagement has also meant that citizens collectively come together to demand political change. In an unprecedented development, just putting a timer, between 2015 and 19, argues Allen and Noyes, 2019, 26 African countries saw power being transferred to new leaders, and only 22 of 45 African leaders who were in power in 2015 were still in office 4 years later, according to Davenport and Tem in 2019. In some of these extraordinary political transitions, some social media rather, particularly online-based organizing in social media itself had a big say. For example, Sudan's Omar al-Bashir, who in his heady days seemed untouchable, faced a series of digitally organized protests and was eventually ousted in 2019 after 30 years in power, as we know. But social media is said to be transforming political cultures. This may or may not be true. In my view, the discussion should focus on the perceived knowledge that is likely being extracted from these digital platforms to help politically reorganize African societies, as we are told. I believe this knowledge largely remains utopian because we cannot, on one hand, celebrate perceived epistemic evolution and on the other, fail to adequately challenge the epistemic injustices surrounding the question of ownership, control, and access to these technologies. Netflix or Spotify subscribers do not own content that they pay for example. A recent World Bank report said 300 million Africans live more than 50 kilometers from a fiber or cable broadband connection. And just over 30% of Africa has access to the internet, according to Kelly 2020 in the same report. Now, there are credible ethical concerns relating to premeditated enforcement and imposition of digital technologies that benefit only a few on Africans. Milner and Traub, 2021 recent book, share interesting insights on the impact of digital technologies. Just as data and algorithms become more and more popular and unpreventable, arguing technological advances are driving society to the brink of worsening inequality and unprecedented control of citizens, consequently propping up long-standing power disparities. And I mentioned power there because also Nanjala was talking about power. Now, power is something that is coming back also in my presentation. For example, in an effort to curb hate speech, misinformation, and all sorts of online extremism, social media companies have overwhelming power to deplatform or shut down anybody who disobeys community rules. Deplatforming, however, is a double-edged sword because while it presumably curtails potential online extremism, it also gives extremists much needed spotlight that potentially helps them earn sympathizers, including financial backers beyond the digital realms. So deplatforming also presents ethical concerns, particularly when it comes to freedom of speech. If social media companies can celebrate their power to remove somebody whose opinion is different from theirs, does that not constitute what Doston 2011 calls epistemic violence? That is, constraining a group's capacity to speak and be heard. Deplatforming citizens potentially presents strenuous challenges as dictators. African dictators will always argue that if Facebook can remove somebody it disagrees with from its platform, African leaders can also justify deporting or jailing critics, setting a dangerous precedent on a continent that, as we know, has long struggled rather with deep-rooted free speech issues. There is obviously a price to pay for deplatforming African politicians, as Twitter recently found out, with Nigeria indefinitely banning the social media platform in June, well, this month, after its president's tweet, as we know, had been removed, leading to his temporary ban from the network. I suppose I end there and hand over to the next speaker. Thank you so much for listening.
Thank you, Bruce. Thank you so much. We'll head over to Julie.
Hello, everyone. Good morning, actually, from the San Francisco Bay Area. I am very happy to be here. Thank you so much, Professor Cheeseman, Dr. Notius, Dr. Garbe, I think I'm right there, for the invitation this morning. My name is Julia Wono, and I wrote an article about entitled Why Silicon Valley Should Be More Responsible in Africa. In that paper, I focused on why the lack of action with regards to content, why this lack of action from social media platforms and on the African continent will threaten the company's profits. I chose this angle because I have been working in the digital rights sphere for the past 12 years now. And what in our interactions, we've had interactions with social media companies and companies, tech companies in general. And we have noticed that our interactions are more understood by this public, not only through the lens of human rights, although many of these companies are committed to human rights, and that is a great progress. But obviously, when their profits are affected, it gives another dimension to the advocacy that we do. So my paper is focusing on, yes, the fact that there are fake news on social media platforms, there are hateful discourses on social media platforms, including shared by very prominent figures and particularly presidents. And that contrary to what we have seen in the West, or also known as the North, or also known as the global minority, as our digital civil society lab director would say, Lucy Bernholz. Well, we have seen that there is a sort of disproportion between the efforts invested by companies. One example is what happened ahead of the US presidential election in 2020. We have seen so many companies roll out policies explaining them to enforce during the election to prevent disinformation, misinformation, and hate speech on their platforms. But we don't see the same amount of efforts on the African continent, despite the huge challenges posed by, well, these platforms, which are positive challenges. Of course, increased freedom of expression, increased access to economic opportunity. There's so many benefits, but these benefits come with huge challenges, especially in societies where the media landscape was owned with a heavy fist by some would call authoritarian regime, but at the very least, regimes that favor control of people and control of information. And the effect of that is transitioning from one media landscape where we had only one voice speaking about what was happening in the country to potentially millions in the country having a smartphone and sharing information. Well, this comes with a lot of challenges. And we don't see the same investment from companies to deal with these issues. The consequences, as we are all aware here, there is currently a civil conflict. Some call it a genocide. I don't have information to that regard, so I won't debate that. But some are pointing to the role played by, well, to the fact that people felt empowered, that there was a normalization of hateful discourses between communities because there was no enforcement on social media platforms. You could see those discourses, you could access them very easily, contrary to what was happening in the physical space. And this is exactly what happened in my country, which is Cameroon, a few years ago in 2018. We were seeing the same pattern. We were seeing that people felt empowered to transport the conflict online, but with taking more aggressive stances, more hateful stances against each other. And we saw that it did threaten peace and security. So why am I talking about this? Is because this is a reality, but this reality, if it's not addressed, it's going to be weaponized and it's going to be used, and it is already being used by those same regime who have lost power, who have lost control over our citizens' narrative, but who now find an opportunity to regain that control by saying, you see, Facebook and Twitter and other platforms are not doing anything. They don't care about peace in our countries. Look, they let fake news flow freely on their social media platforms. This is dangerous. We need to block. And the problem is with that is in the public opinion, we are seeing increasingly acceptance that, yes, to deal with fake news, to deal with hate speech, we have to allow our governments to shut down access to those platforms or even the internet. This is particularly shocking because we know, as Nanjala was saying, we know that the worst actors, honestly, on these debates are usually those very same states. So we are seeing a problem that is very real, being weaponized by actors who have interest in doing so, just because platforms have decided, I think, not so wisely, that because these countries are located on a continent that probably does not have the same market interest as of now, compared to the US, where they're risking regulation, where they're risking antitrust, where they're risking a lot, investors' distrust, etc. Well, it's probably not worth investing that much to deal with those problems. It's not me saying this. It's a leak. How do you call it? A whistle that has been blown by a former employee of Facebook who has precisely said that she was shocked to see the lack of action depending on the market that the company was talking about. So I'm in my article, I argued that this is dangerous for freedom of expression in general, freedom of expression of African citizens. I think to some extent, although we would have to dissect that, to some extent, the Twitter ban is exactly the proof of this politicization, of this weaponization of content moderation on the African continent that is not beneficial to the citizens, that is definitely not beneficial to the companies. And in my article, I urge companies to, be more responsible, basically. Being more responsible means being more proactive on this problem, not waiting until that they happen to realize that there is a problem that they need to act. Because when we get to that point, it's already, I think, quite late, at least from the perspective of giving the opportunity to governments to weaponize that vulnerability. So yes, I think, and speaking also, of course, in my position at the Facebook Oversight Board, I think it's an emergency for companies, a market emergency as well, because when they are not available, well, other products are available which have exactly the same features, except that they give ability to governments to control the information. And this is, again, what is happening seemingly in the Twitter ban, where we have reports appearing in the press that the authorities have been considering putting in place a sort of a firewall filtering the internet, a filtered internet accessible to the citizens. So I will stop there, and I look forward to the conversation. I will now pass it on to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie, for this really powerful call. We'll now hand over to our last speaker, Professor Herman Wasserman from the University of Cape Town. I'll leave the floor to you.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for this invitation. I think I'll be brief because I think much of what I will say has already been said and overlaps with some of the other topics and issues that people have mentioned. I'd like to focus, I think, on what I consider one of the most pertinent issues in today's African media landscape, and that is that of disinformation, or fake news, as it's often referred to. And as some of the other speakers have also mentioned, it has implications for also for hate speech. Sometimes it takes the form of hate speech. It has implications for democracy and society more broadly. And often it has the sort of consequences that others have also alluded to already, like internet shutdowns and so on. I think, and again, as others have mentioned, this area as well is one of those areas where there's currently actually a great deal of attention being paid to disinformation and scholarship globally, but comparatively little to how that phenomenon manifests in the global South. And then especially in Africa, also, I think from a sort of more cultural perspective and maybe from a more longitudinal perspective, how this phenomenon maps onto earlier histories, social histories, political systems, other areas of focus that I think scholars have been researching for a long time, but that those connections aren't always being made. So I could highlight, for instance, some of the research that I've done with a colleague, Danny Madrid Morales from Houston, and some of the work, or most of the work actually, that we've been focusing on had to do with motivations. In other words, why do people consume this information, and especially why do they share it? So the first thing that our research has shown is that there's the perceived exposure to disinformation in African countries, and those we've already studied 6 sub-Saharan African countries. Is very high. It is actually in 3 of those countries that we've looked at this specifically, that perceived exposure is comparatively much higher than a place like the US, even if much of the scholarly research focuses on the US and Europe. I think especially worrying is one of the findings that we've seen in our research is that disinformation has become entrenched in African societies. It's already part of people's practices of how they engage with social media, for instance. People report that they would willingly share information on social media, even if they know or suspect it to be false. Again, more so than in places like the US. And the reasons, when asked, the reasons that they give why they do this is, for instance, to create awareness for people to respond to them, to interact with them. We know we're in that ecology of likes and in attention, but also from a sort of misplaced sense of civic duty. The idea that I would share this information, even if I know or suspect it to be false, because it might help somebody. And there, I think we are getting closer to maybe a sort of cultural and social sensibility on the continent that feeds into these practices, that of community and that of maybe being connected to networks, informal networks of communication. And the third major reason why we've found people share disinformation is for fun, is for a laugh, is something that they feel that might bring some humor to the discourse. And that, especially that last aspect, I think maps onto what we know from our longer literature on the continent and the role that satire and humor has played. And this has often been a progressive role. We know that humor, satire, gossip, and so on has often played the role of undermining official state narratives or narratives coming from state-owned media. We know also that there's the notion of a pavement radio, Stephen Ellis's classic term of radio trottoir. All of that, I think, maps onto these practices. And so we have to understand, I think, if we want to address this, how the social and cultural dynamics on the continent might give the practices of disinformation on the continent a very specific type of, specific character that makes it different from the same phenomenon somewhere else. We know that it's very dangerous for various reasons. It has already taken the form of inciting violence, hate speech, racist, misogyny, xenophobic messages. I think we're all familiar with those dangers. And especially now in the context of the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen that disinformation has also contributed to the spread of false information about virus transmission, treatments, cures, and vaccines that are literally costing people's lives. So socially and culturally and politically, this is a very important aspect. We know that it has been used to undermine election campaigns already, to counter corruption investigations. Maybe the most egregious example of this was the Bell Pottinger scandal in South Africa, where a concerted disinformation campaign was used to deflect criticism and deflect investigation into corruption allegations against former President Jacob Zuma. But as other speakers have also mentioned, and I'll end with this reminder, is that disinformation is also used as a smokescreen often for authoritarian control. So while disinformation in itself is highly problematic for all the reasons that I've mentioned and others, it is also problematic because the rhetoric of fact-checking or the rhetoric of stamping out fake news or disinformation has become an excuse, a way for governments to clamp down on dissidents, to shut down internets, and to undermine fragile freedoms. So I think I would like to flag this as an area of importance because it maps onto fragile political systems in Africa, maps onto social polarization, and it maps onto longer social cultural histories. So those overlaps, I think, are important to study and should be high on the research agenda for years to come. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Herman. I'm delighted to be able to now introduce as our discussant, Idiat Hassan, the director of CDD West Africa. Not only someone who's working at the thick of this and of course can talk to us about the Twitter ban in Nigeria, among other things, but also I think actually you are the person who is most published in this volume, because as well as writing the introduction of myself and Lisa, you have a couple of pieces in there yourself as part of your co-author teams doing great research in countries like Gambia. So congratulations, I think you're the most published person in this particular collection. Now I'm going to go to you in a moment for some reflections on what our panel has said so far. Perhaps you want to bring in that recent Nigerian experience and what it's telling us. While you're sort of thinking of those reflections, I'll just give us the poll results. So the poll results are in. We asked you at the beginning of this discussion what you thought, the audience this is, what you thought was the most challenging feature of digitization for African politics and society. The winner, and perhaps this is influenced by the moment we're in, I think Carolyn Logan is on the call, the Afrobarometer researcher, and I think Carolyn might tell us that when you do a survey shapes the outcomes, because the winner, number one, is censorship and the blocking of the internet at 32%. I wonder if we'd done it a little while ago when there wasn't the internet ban, the Twitter ban in Nigeria, whether we would have had fake news as being number one, but fake news is number two at 24%. Number three, and I think this reflects the fact that we have a number of citizens of African countries in the audience joining us today, is the high cost unaffordability of internet access, which is joint at 24% with fake news. So those are the top three. The other factors that we had there, just for those who haven't seen them, were the dominance of multinational firms, the impact of artificial intelligence, growing surveillance and breaches of privacy, and the lack of data privacy regulation. All of those got a few votes, but much lower than the other three. So what we're taking from the poll is that our audience, which is a very educated audience today, thinks that censorship and the blocking of the internet, cost and affordability, and the spread of fake news are the three most important issues. Be interested for all of the panel, when we come back to you in a minute, whether or not you would agree with that top three. But without further ado, Idiat, love to come to you and to hear a little bit of your reflections, particularly given where we are in Nigeria right now. For everybody else in the audience, please do put your questions in the Q&A. We've already got 6, which is great, and I will be reading some of those out to the audience in the Q&A, which will happen just after this discussion. Idiat, over to you.
Oh, thank you very much. So I'll act like the government of Nigeria or the minister would say. I think the first thing that comes to their mind in Nigeria, one is they sit behind a desk and they think of a video shot in Mali, but which is actually being put out as a video of what is actually happening in the northwest of Nigeria. The likelihood of this to actually ignite conflict and more killings where there are already several killings. The second scenario would be a Photoshop or deep fake of President Buhari, who is seen to be a clone. I think that's the most successful fake news in Nigeria. And even educated people believed it until last week when we had our president for 3 consecutive days speaking to us, 2 unscripted, that it was actually that man is no Buhari because of his fresh skin, which they showed again and keep bringing up on regular basis. Then the increasing use of audios, sometimes imitating an authoritative figure, even at times you just joint audios severally put together with so much authority and which can actually turn the whole state on fire, which can put the state on fire. So that's what Minister Lai Mohammed will actually tell you. And the implication of this in a very fragile country and people painting the picture of Rwanda, which is about to happen in Nigeria with the proliferation of insecurity across the 6 geopolitical zone. And of course, the use of Twitter as the platform to mobilize for the NSAS, which is the most successful campaign and protest movement in the last decade in Nigeria. There is nothing. In fact, according to the president, the children, he referred them as to children and young people, are going to march into Aso Rock and remove him from office. So what do we expect if he does not think in terms of climbing down on this platform? And in particular, why we talk so much, there is really little or no platform responsibility, which we all know. But one thing we often do not talk about is also the influence industry and what they are actually doing on this continent. And I think that listening to everybody, I really want to reflect on that, then conclude by talking about the creeping in of digital authoritarianism, which all the contributors have actually spoken about. One thing that I have actually found in terms of doing lots of work of recent in West Africa is that increasingly, the continent is actually being used as a launching pad or a test pad for most of this technology to be used elsewhere. So Cambridge Analytica interference in the Nigerian and Kenyan election is an example, and we saw what they eventually did with that in the US and the UK elections. Importantly, is also the fact that while we talk in terms of this, most of this influence, the influence industry is also operating out of the continent. So to interfere in other elections. So Nigeria and Ghana are examples of the launch pad to interfere by Russia in the US elections. What this does is that it has already created an army of young people who are now so skilled in this that they can actually bring about war. Then of course, the lack of accountability. A co-author, when we look at the influence industry and personal data, spoke only about one thing, the fact that Nigeria claimed that it was going to hold people responsible for Cambridge Analytica accountable, but at no point did either arrest anybody or the investigation report was seen. So it shows that there is actually little or no incentive to hold people accountable, and especially where we have very lax data laws. So we have a digital policy, digital act, but where are the privacy rules? And who knows what is actually done with data? And how sophisticated even the mechanisms are, the techniques that we cannot even carry on with. When you look at psychometric profiling, you will be surprised that that has actually been used in Nigeria, in previous Nigeria's election. But I think what really worries me the most as a person, and which other speakers have actually referred to, is gradually the creeping in of digital authoritarianism and the challenges that it actually portends. Internet shutdown are things that Julie Owono, I think she wrote a piece for CDD last week on it. But more, what about the surveillance technology which are being sold by China, Russia, Israel? And who benefits from this? All in the need of saying we want to counter fake news, or it's usually opposition politicians and civil society actors themselves. So they can read your WhatsApp at every point in time here in Nigeria as well. Then the restricting of the online spaces, freedom of expression, which the big issue about Nigeria is today. It's not just that Twitter has been banned, but we've been told not to call it ban, that we should actually call it suspension, because with a ban, it means it will never come up again. But with a suspension, they can actually think in terms of lifting it. But it's also important that as I sat here, I saw an alert that there was a public hearing today at the National Assembly, and the government is actually talking about including social media platform on the National Broadcasting Commission code so they can actually regulate this platform itself. What it does is that it takes away voices for the voiceless in particular. And the fact that this is a very cheap platform which we all engage with and we have actually used to push policy and change accountability. I think the introduction of social media taxes are all very, very important. And it came across in some of the work. I think Kofi also wrote something really important about artificial intelligence and how that is actually being used. If you look at the level of automation in Nigeria, is at 19.5%, because at the CDD, we examined 33 million tweets and we found automation level or at 19.5%, which is extremely high for a country. And the introduction of online trolls, pro-government online trolls, would then climb down on figures or delegitimize. So if you ask Nigerians, why are we happy today? We have peace. As we are here, I don't have to start checking my tweet feed or checking the CDD Twitter feed to be sure that they are not writing anything against us by the pro-government trolls who are actually online. And mass surveillance. And I think these are really critical because it should actually tell us that our work is clearly cut for us and the kind of research that we should actually be doing. One, importantly, is looking into the influence industry more and more and trying to actually hold them accountable. I don't know where that will be and at what level it will be. Secondly, is platform responsibility. It's become very, very imperative that it actually happens. Yes, Twitter is talking to Nigeria, but at every point in time, how receptive are they in terms of removing content? In fact, I think kudos to Twitter, who have actually done better compared to Facebook and even Google without prompts. We've also worked with this platform where we came as a group in 4 countries to look at data and submitted to Facebook. Out of 30 submitted by the CDD, only 4 was eventually removed. And this is a collaborative work. How do we hold the platform to account? That is important. Then how do we fight back against digital authoritarianism? Fight back not only, but build capacity to engage, especially as the digital is become more and more sophisticated and artificial intelligence is becoming to determine the way things are actually done. Thank you, Nick.
Thank you very much for that. I'm going to add a question and then throw it back to the audience, and then we're going to get into the Q&A. And for those of you in the audience who are putting in questions, which is great, please put them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because then they go through to the speakers and the speakers can see them in advance, and it's the Q&A that we'll be using. So the Q&A function, please use that rather than the chat for your questions. The other thing I wanted to throw back to some of the speakers is I think we've had a really great deconstruction of the multiple challenges that we're facing. And I agree with a number of the speakers that things are likely to get worse before they get better. So I wonder if before we go to the Q&A, we've got any kind of positive spins or potential solutions that we want to talk about. So, you know, when it comes to fake news, what's the solution? I think most of us would say the solution isn't simply to have a lot of censorship, because the censorship, as soon as that comes in, we take away everything that's special about social media, everything that's democratic and potentially transformative about it. And I think most of the opposition leaders and the civil society leaders that I've talked to say, don't simply allow governments to censor social media. That makes it then the same as all other media. You simply reproduce the government hegemony that you have already in other areas. So if we don't deal with fake news by moving down the direction of some form of censorship, what is the solution? Is it education? Is it digital literacy? Is it changes to the platforms themselves? Similarly, when it comes to some of the other questions that have come up, we've got a nice question that's come up in the Q&A about, are these companies going to actually have the locally sensitive knowledge that they will need to be able to understand the impact of their services, to be able to differentiate between good and not good messages? And that then I think raises a really good question about what should Twitter and Facebook should be doing. I think one fairly obvious thing would be to have more of a presence in Africa, to try and understand and listen more in Africa. Obviously we now see bases in places like Ghana, but no presence in much of the continent, and a very limited presence where there is one. So do we need, social media companies, big tech companies, to start having a more of a presence in Africa so they can understand these issues more generally, and so on? What should be the response to, internet shutdowns or to Twitter shutdowns? Are the ways that we can push back? So along with the comments that Idiad has already said, along with, of course, the things that you've already heard other panelists say, I would like to give all of the panelists an opportunity to come back to this. And then, as I say, we'll go to the Q&A. We've already got some great questions. Others, please come in. So I see Nanjala and Julie are keen to come in. So we'll go to them. Then I'll come to Herman and Bruce after that. And please feel free to come in on any of the things that we've talked about so far. So over to you, Nanjala.
Yeah, I wanted to come back on this and just idea of fake news and misinformation. And basically, I just want to say, I think it's important to resist the idea that Africa is somehow unusual or bizarre in the way that misinformation is both created and travels through the continent. And I want to put three things on the table. One is misinformation only travels when there's no countervailing force that is trusted, that provides information that is, contrary to that. And we've seen that in a lot of African countries, there is no strong traditional media, there is no strong, and even in countries like Kenya, where there is a strong traditional media, there is a history of co-optation and a history of manipulation. And so but these are not uniquely African problems. I mean, we're seeing the same challenges in Hungary, we're seeing the same challenges in Belarus, we're seeing the same challenges all across Central Asia. And I think the idea that somehow African culture makes us more susceptible to misinformation than people in other places, I find deeply problematic. In fact, if you look at what happened with the coronavirus, for example, the number one source spreader of misinformation of the coronavirus in the entire world was Donald Trump. This is a study that has been undertaken by, I think, both Facebook and I'd have to double check who the other people, the Berkman Klein Center at Harvard, that most of the posts that had the most impact, we saw when Donald Trump, for example, posted about HCQ, hydrochloroquine, as a treatment for the coronavirus, that there was a spike in demand for HCQ in Uganda that led to a shortage of HCQ in Uganda. And that was not caused by Ugandan misinformation, that was American misinformation traveling to Uganda. We've seen the same impact. The people who crafted the misinformation narratives in Kenya around the election in 2017 were American companies. And this goes into what Idat was saying about how the persuasion economy and the persuasion industry and the political persuasion industry, being Bell Pottinger is a British company, Cambridge Analytica is a British company, Harris Media is an American company. The investment, the commercial investment in misinformation on the continent is not primarily being driven by Africans. It is being driven by people who have interests elsewhere. And so I think the idea, we have to sort of separate that from there being some kind of cultural predictor of misinformation, when in fact what it is that there's an outsized investment in misinformation on the continent, because, as Ida had said, and I've made this case in other pieces of research as well, there's more money to be made. There's more money to be made in an African election than there is to be made in an American election, because of the scope and the space for money, for profiteering that exists. So I really want to resist that idea. And I also want to underscore that looking at misinformation outside a historical context, I think, and in this idea of newness, I think it's also a problem that misinformation, we might have new labels for misinformation, disinformation, malinformation, whatever, but using lies basically and misrepresenting the truth in order to influence political outcomes in and of itself is not new. Propaganda is not new. Governments investing in propaganda is not new. And we're dealing with audiences, and again, I come back to the Kenyan case, we're dealing with audiences that have a long history of navigating propaganda, especially state-driven propaganda. And so the mistrust of official information isn't necessarily coming from an abstract place of, there's no history there, that why don't they believe what the government is saying? Well, because the government's been lying to us for 50 years. And I think when you look at how the coronavirus, again, was an excellent example of this. Once there was a concerted effort to actually put trusted information onto the network. Once there was an investment, WHO, but also the Ministry of Health and other institutions to push back, the response was much better than what we've seen in the United States, where a year later, they're still dealing with misinformation, lies, myths that were propagated a year or two ago. Whereas here, a lot of the things that had gone viral at the beginning of the pandemic have more or less disappeared. So, it's just to say that the intersection between technology and politics, I think, cuts both ways. It's not just looking at how technology shapes cultures, but also that there is also, I could give you a long story, but really what I'm trying to say is I think we have to give African societies a little bit more of a benefit of the doubt when we think about how some of these things are going to play out. Thank you.
Thanks, Nanjala. I think that's a brilliant point. And you've kind of linked into something I was hoping to say later, which is exactly that I think often there's a kind of sense here that African citizens are somehow kind of passive receptors of information and simply believe every fake news story that comes along. And I think we have a lot of evidence that that's not true. And we did a survey a little while back now in Kenya, where we looked at different sources of information and how much people trusted them. And in the Kenyan context, people were much less likely to trust something like WhatsApp than they were Twitter, much less likely to trust Twitter and Facebook than they were radio, and much less likely, I think, to trust radio than newspapers. That was something like the ranking. So you could see that people knew that these media sources that were new were providing information that might well not be completely reliable. And you could see that people were trying to evaluate how reliable and trustworthy different platforms were and the kind of information that they received on different platforms. And I think that's something that often gets lost in this, that people, like you say, are often quite skeptical precisely because they've been lied to for a long time. They've seen censorship for a long time, and they take that into often WhatsApp. And I think one of the things I would love to see more research on is what kinds of messages are believed, what kinds of messages are not believed, and what shapes that, because it's certainly the case that not everything is simply being received, as you say. So I think that was a really important intervention. I'm going to go to Judy and Herman and Bruce now. I think Judy was first. So Judy, over to you, and then Herman and then Bruce.
Thank you, Nick. Thank you so much, Nanjala. What you just said is extremely important to help us reframe, our perceptions on these very, very sensitive issues. There are three remarks that I wanted to add and probably respond to the second question that you asked, Nick, from the audience, which was how to help platforms basically know better the local context and the local knowledge. So the first remark that I wanted to share is that on what to do against fake news. I think it's important to, like you rightly pointed, Nick and Nanjala, is those who are responsible for the situation we are in are not, honestly, not platforms. These are governments who have not been investing, for instance, in education, who have not been investing on media, on diversity of media, on supporting that diversity of media. And the consequence is that, yes, we end up at a moment when I was saying we're transitioning from a time when we had controlled media, or at least very few voices, to suddenly having potentially millions. It's challenging, to say the least. So I personally resist also this narrative around this is the fault of the users. And that's also something that the platforms are trying to tell us. They're trying to tell us, well, we cannot protect you against fake news. You have to, tweak your algorithms. We'll leave you more room to tweak your algorithms and just choose what you want to see. This is not the problem. There are more systemic problems at the very base. And unless we address them, we're going to talk about the same things in 20 years, except that we will be at the time when all this fake news, all this disinformation environment will be fueled by artificial intelligence. And we obviously don't want that, especially on a continent when there is no data protection legislation. The second remark that I wanted to share is we all have this obsession, and especially governments right now, this sudden urge to fight fake news, which is I mean, it's absolutely fair, but we should absolutely be aware of where we are heading with this fight against disinformation, and especially beware that it does not become a fight against expression. I will give two examples which are, for me, particularly striking when I'm trying to make this point. The first one is the case of a Beninese, I never know how to say that in English, Beninois journalist who was arrested and jailed for 6 months after he had reported he was participating in a conference against disinformation organized by a French media agency, French cooperation agency, CFI. And during that conference, the minister, I think not the minister, the procureur, the prosecutor of Cotonou was sharing remarks about how the government had passed a law against fake news precisely to go after journalists who are doing investigations. And he quoted the prosecutor saying that, and he was jailed for that, for sharing fake news based on the very law the prosecutor was denouncing. He was arrested allegedly for sharing fake news, and he spent 6 months in jail. So I think it's also important when we're working on these issues to question what is that? I mean, what are we even calling fake news? You know, as the second example I want to share, it's not to sow doubt or anything. It's really to force us to be more critical, because what we may end up doing is actually fighting very valid speech. And it's also a reason why I personally joined the Facebook Oversight Board, so that we don't get lost into the principles, but also look at the reality. The second story that I wanted to share is that of another issue that I'm very that's quite close to my heart, which is the issue of the franc CFA, CFA franc in West and Central Africa, a currency used by 14 countries, allegedly a remnant of the French colonial past. That currency was fought by groups that at some point had been exploited, definitely had been weaponized by Russian agents, or at least for objective reasons, they formed objective alliances to pass that message on. This was considered fake news. And even, I mean, these networks denouncing the franc CFA were considered as purveyors of fake news. Many of them had seen their accounts being taken down on on Facebook. I apologize. But a few months later, we suddenly heard that this very same currency that was considered a fake news, the denouncement of which was considered a fake news, this currency was going to be changed and replaced by a new currency called now the ECHO in West Africa. So I'm sharing these two examples to say, yes, there is an urgency to fight fake news, but we should not forget that for years, the sharing of false information already was prohibited by governments in a way to better control the narrative. And the third aspect that I wanted to share, and I'm sorry I talked too much, the third aspect is how to help platforms better know the local knowledge. I personally am not in favor of necessarily having local offices, because that is dangerous too. That puts employees at risk. We have to remember in Egypt in 2011, when the government wanted to shut down the internet, they arrested employees of Orange at the time. So we really don't want to go that way. So instead, what we are fighting for at Internet Sans Frontières, and that's something that I personally am working on, is how can we enhance the current engagement that exists between private companies and local experts, and particularly civil society organizations. The engagement as it exists today is extremely frustrating, because first of all, we don't know what happens with all the reports that we send them. Do they read it? I'm sure they do, but what do they do of it? How does that transform that? How is it translated into the product that is available to users? And it's a step that we want to go to, create more interactions between civil society organizations and product teams, who are extremely important, who are left apart in this conversation, but who are central, because they are the ones who implement the changes that we want to see on the platforms. So that's what I wanted to address. Thank you.
That was just brilliant, Julie. I love the detail there, but also, you know, the constructive, thoughtful ideas about the ways that we can go forwards. And, you know, you flagged another thing there about a way in which, you know, on the spur of the moment, you might think this is a great way to strengthen things, but actually it's a risk because it can be itself manipulated. And so I think it's exactly that kind of careful thinking through of practical suggestions that we really need. So thank you. That was really fabulous. Going over to you now, Herman, and Bruce after that.
Yeah, thanks. I just want to maybe address some of the I would say misconceptions about why it is important to focus on audiences and or users. I mean, that's not for a moment to suggest that platforms or governments and so on are not at fault and that they shouldn't be addressed. In fact, I think why it is important is exactly because we have seen these examples of how users have agency. I mean, in our research around media users and their responses to disinformation online. I mean, we've you know, looked at 6 sub-Saharan African countries where it is clear that people have they can pick up on cues. They know how to sort fact from fiction. They know you know, what sort of clues to look for. And certainly also there are many organizations on the continent that are very active in fighting disinformation, fact-checking organizations, media literacy organizations, people that work in the policy space. And so there's certainly, it's not to suggest that there, you know, that Africans are sort of just passive receivers of this. But I think what is important to recognize is that, you know, that we should not look at this ahistorically, and we should not look at this devoid from context. I think it is important to recognize that disinformation and its spread happens within specific contexts, and it happens within specific histories. And so to just import perspectives and approaches from Europe and North America and to say that these are adequate to understand the way that it operates within Africa, I think is not sufficient. I think I would also like to guard against the notion that, you know, it is either or, you know, that the blame and the responsibility for addressing disinformation lies either with audiences, either with users, either with journalists, either with platforms. I think it's a multi-leveled phenomenon. So at the same time as we have to address issues around platforms and their responsibility, we also have to look at regulation, but also the problematic aspects of regulation, the fact that governments can also use regulation to stifle dissent, for instance. And at the same time, not only look at countering and resisting disinformation, but also look at what is needed to support the development of good information. And so the support of media freedom, for instance, would go hand in hand with that. The support for media organizations, media development, you know, as controversial as that has been on the continent, but there are ways of doing that to support independent media that can provide good alternative information where people can go and find the information that they need and that they can use to empower themselves. So I would just want to guard against this sort of a binary thinking of saying that it is either responsibility of, you know, one specific group, one specific platform, one specific organization. I think this is a multi-level problem and a problem that has to be addressed from, you know, attacked from various angles.
Thanks, Herman. I think that's a really great point. Over to you, Bruce.
Thanks, Nick. And well, what I'm going to say is kind of, you know, it's part of it. Herman already sort of touched on it. Well, I think I'm a bit more traditional in my approach to this. I think instead of sort of celebrating this notion of, look, we have technologies and people are benefiting from them. I personally think, you know, we should guard against sort of foisting these technologies on these people. First of all, do they really need these technologies? You know, if somebody is living in a village where perhaps only one person has a mobile phone, they probably have not heard of disinformation or misinformation. It's yet, of course, there's that sort of perpetuation of you know, notions that everybody really needs to be on social media, and you know, because of the ubiquity of these technologies, it's good for society. You know, thinking of, say, the Botswana government forcing the San people to not live according to their traditional ways of living because they are considered to not be modern. I find that to be disrespectful because African problems, if we go back to history, have always been external. They've always come from someone, some people who came from somewhere. And I think this sort of works very well with the concept of digital colonialism, which Michael Quaid has been talking about the last few years now. And I believe the problem, people, when they are looking at the problem, they tend to talk about the people who are the receivers, who are taking these technologies and adapting them and using them. But the problem, in my view, actually lies in San Francisco, where Julie is, right? These technology companies, they have so much power, and I think we need to, or there must be a way to stop them, because when people don't have anybody who doesn't have access to these technologies, perhaps does not know or has never heard of these problems. It's only those of us who are there on social media who have to deal with this. So if to answer your question on, so what is the solution to this? Maybe avoidance, and not trying to make people believe that if you are not on social media, if you don't have a mobile phone, if you don't have access to technology, you are still backward. I find that to be slightly disrespectful. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Okay, we're coming towards the end, but we've got time for another set of questions. So I'm going to ask the questions, and then I'm going to ask our presenters to come in and give us short and snappy responses. So 30 seconds to 1 minute, please, because we're starting to run out of time. Lisa, I'm wondering whether you might want to come in and say something about internet shutdowns, etc. Tucson, I'm wondering whether you might want to come in as well. Idiad, of course, you can come in. So for everybody, please just put your hand up if you want to take on one of these. So Callum has asked, as Chinese influence is something that's often discussed, is there a role that China is playing here in facilitating the spread of censorship or problematic AI security technology? I think we could add to China a number of other governments as well. It's certainly not just China, and of course the US and the UK are involved in this as well, but that role of international actors providing censorship technology is a good question. So thank you, Callum. We have a question here from Christopher, which is about essentially autocratic regimes in the global south. He's saying they seem to have more of an upper hand when it comes to censoring citizens. Are digital companies allowing themselves to be influenced, coerced, hoodwinked by authoritarian regimes? And I think that question from Christopher connects to a question from a number of others, which is about basically, do we need somebody to be regulating the kind of regulators? So Facebook and Twitter are looking at messages and sometimes now censoring those, but who is regulating those social media companies, and who is regulating them from the African perspective? I think that's something that's coming up from a number of the different questions that we have here. Just a couple more, and then I'll encourage you to come in and see which ones you might want to answer. Christopher asks, is increased surveillance or perceived surveillance leading to increased self-censorship and inhibiting citizens of their use of the internet? I think that's a really great question. Are people becoming increasingly careful about what they say on Twitter and Facebook as a result of, for example, the fact that we started to see authoritarian governments clamp down and actually arrest, etc., people who have been making statements? We've certainly seen some countries where authoritarian governments have clearly tried to go after people as a deliberate way of intimidating that kind of free speech. So I think that's a really nice question. And Tony Roberts here asking about what are we learning about private sector actors who are themselves enabling digital authoritarianism? So coming back to a kind of common theme here. And finally, from an anonymous attendee, what is the best way for social media companies to review and respond to flagged content? From fake news to harassment, blatantly problematic flagged content often remains online. So a great set of questions there. I can see Lisa's got a hand up, so I'm going to come to her, and then I'll encourage all of the other panelists to respond to any of those that they would like. Lisa, over to you.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah, maybe briefly about shutdowns and then also touching on the question about Chinese involvement. maybe from my own research perspective, being interested in companies' involvement in shutdowns, I'm going to flag just a few things that I think need more research. One of them is the question of really understanding who's involved. I mean, from all of the measurement people that are involved in measuring internet activity and shutdowns, we already know when these happen, but we still often do not really know which companies are involved and how do they differ in their engagement. And I think that's important because that would also open up a broader debate on what wiggle room do companies have? How can they try to resist shutdowns by maybe using the opportunities that governments have very broad requests sometimes, so that they could still use this opportunity to make the shutdown not as severe, for instance. And then also, I think the role of license agreements is something that we need to focus on. What kind of license agreements should companies avoid when making a decision to invest in African countries? And what are the standards that we should especially expect from Western companies investing in telecom infrastructure? And from a recent discussion I had with telecom operators, I also know that it is an increasing problem that governments themselves install deep packet inspection software on the network of operators, so that that makes the problem even worse, because then it's really governments controlling the infrastructure operated by private companies. And when it comes to Chinese involvement, focusing less on AI but more on infrastructure in the first place, I think here we know far too little. We focus a lot on multinational Western companies who are the main actors in telecom, but a lot of the passive infrastructure, the towers, etc., they're increasingly owned by Chinese investors, and we do not know how, like, the scope of what, how much of this infrastructure is owned by Chinese investors and what the consequences are. So these are just a couple of thoughts. Thanks, Nick.
Thanks so much. We're going to go to Julie now, and after Julie on to Iliad. And then after that, I'll be passing back to Lisa and Toussaint just to say a couple of words to conclude and to wrap up. So Julie, over to you.
Thank you. Rapidly in two propositions. Thank you so much. I think the question came from Dr. Fomunyo, so I'm very glad to see he's here. To respond to the question, how can we make sure, who's watching those who are watching, basically? Who's watching the governments? Who's making sure that the platforms are not submitting to illegal requests when it comes to content? That's precisely the role that we play at the Facebook Oversight Board. When we have a case, and we've had one recently from India, we do not shy away from asking questions to the company. Did you receive an order from the authorities asking you to take down content from this or XYZ group? And are you facing, what are the challenges that you're facing when it comes to moderating and when it comes to relationship with the government? The company does not necessarily answer publicly, but this allows us to make recommendations, and our recommendations are non-binding, but the company has to respond to them and I have to explain when it will implement it or why it would not implement them. And I think this form of accountability, although non-binding, because I think it would be difficult to have binding obligations here, but rather this open conversation is something that can help us shed more light on the pressures that the companies are receiving from governments, and also open up conversation on how to counter those pressures. And I think one of the ways to counter those pressures, and that's the second remark that I would like to make and answer one of the other question, is I think it's really time, especially when it comes to content, that we have a multi-stakeholder conversation, dialogue, collaborations on how we should deal with those content. It should not be a conversation involving only companies and governments, because we know that that will end up into censorship. We need to include experts, academia, communities who are facing the dangers of these problems, and civil society organizations in general, we need to include them in the conversation. We need them at the table, and we need to collaborate with them. I say we as the community, the world community. So that's one of the, I think that's one of the ways we should go now, because we cannot trust governments only, we cannot trust companies only, but we definitely can trust civil society organizations who have been finding solutions, thinking about solutions about these problems for a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. I just wanted to alert people that Dr. Jojo Carlin, at Jojo Carlin on Twitter, has done the most brilliant drawing of this webinar of all of you guys. You can see all of you guys there, and they've done a sensational job. So go on to Twitter, check out Dr. Jojo Carlin, at Jojo Carlin, and love and retweet that, because that's the best thing I've seen. And that's making me feel even more excited about organizing more webinars, but only if Dr. Jojo Carlin can come to all of them. That's really lifted my spirits. Over to you, Nanjala.
Can you hear me? Sorry. This private sector question, because I think it's a really important one. And again, my whole thing is about resisting fallacies. And the one fallacy is that China private sector bad, Western private sector good, because actually the line is a little bit more blurred than that. And we've seen, for example, its Israeli company NSO partnership with governments like Rwanda, governments like South Africa, not South Africa, governments like Rwanda, governments like the Lesotho, for example, when it comes to surveillance, when it comes to providing information, tracking dissidents, and finding them halfway around the world. And so really what we should be focusing on is not necessarily a geographically bound idea of which private sector actors we should pay attention to and not pay attention to, but the role of money in influencing and private corporate interests that have nothing to do with normative interests of human rights, of inclusion, of representation, of democracy even. What space is being created for profiteering to influence democratic outcomes, social political outcomes? And that is the question of surveillance and self-censorship, because it's the consequences, right? It's the Rwandan government finding dissidents in South Africa, finding dissidents in Belgium, and having them arrested and having them repatriated. That is all part of this whole conversation of what is profiteering doing to the space that exists online for Africans to participate, to use the internet as a space for democracy. And finally, on the point of responding to flagged content, I think one simple thing that is really important to keep pushing is the idea of content moderation as a corporate responsibility rather than a responsibility, as Julie was saying, that lies only in the users, that lies only in the people who are on the platform, and to actually push these companies to keep investing in content moderation, not as an accidental or an afterthought, but actually have it built into the model of rolling out into a new country, building in the language services, building in the oversight before you start thinking about how are we going to maximize profits in this particular country.
Brilliant, thanks, Nanjala. And we've got Ibrahim has asked me to read out his question. I think we kind of covered your question a little bit, Ibrahim, but it is a great question. So I'll read it out, and Idiat and Lisa and Tucson may want to reflect on it in their very final comments. Ibrahim is saying that now the poll has shown that the spread of fake news poses challenges to democracy, but there's also concern over censorship. What is the right balance to strike between reducing the spread of fake news and with regulations while limiting the government's ability to undermine free speech? So what's the balance that needs to be struck there? And I think that's something that many of our comments have come back to. So going to Idiat, I see Herman's put his hand up. So Idiat, Herman, and then we'll go back to Lisa and Tucson for the very end. And we're running out of time now, so please everyone keep your answers nice and short. Thanks so much. So over to you, Idiat.
Thank you very much, Nick. I think that it's good that Ibrahim has taken us back to what the reality really is in terms of what our outlook and plan will be in terms of artificial intelligence and the risk of the risk fake news actually poses to identity conflict, even used by transnational violent extremist group. It's bound to rise in coming years, and there is actually a need to actually push back. And it still goes back to the issue of platform moderation and accountability as being extremely key. most times the platform push back on the fact that how many people do have access to the internet, or how many people do have access to smartphone. But I want to say that our work has actually shown us that even though there are a small percentage of citizens in most villages that do have access to phone or internet, but there are also very influential individuals who allow these to get onto them, and the thin line between the online and the offline. So there is a need for an accountability mechanism that works in terms of what are the barest minimum this platform must do, and holding them to account on the African continent, maybe something like just like the EU is doing, to be replicated at the African Union level and at the Regional Economic Commission. Second, and very important, is the fact that yes, China is actually selling surveillance the same way it's going around with its Belt Road Initiative program in places like Uganda, Tanzania, recently in Nigeria also, they are planning to build this firewall. But we should not just concentrate on China without looking at what Turkey, Russia, Iran, even some of the Gulf countries are doing in various parts of Africa, either as it leads to, as it's associated with disinformation, or more so the selling of surveillance and other technical one. And I think my final point is that we really need to look deeply into the influence industry, who, if are not held to account, will always push for money at the expense of lives of the citizens of this continent. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Idia. That's a great point. And finally, we're going to go to Herman before going to Lisa and Bruce to wrap up.
Thanks. Yes, I just want to respond to that question. I think it's very good that you know, was it Ibrahim? I think that posed the question around balancing. We'll use the word balance, you know, because I think if you go and look at the report that UNESCO actually brought out, and it was actually called Balancing Act, and I think this is exactly what is required, is a balancing act between different types of responses. So on the one hand, you have regulation. Yes, you have regulatory responses. You have platform responses that we've already looked at, but there are also responses that I think that citizens, and we've seen citizens take action against. For instance, Bell Pottinger was brought down by citizens, and you know, we've seen many of those examples. So also the responses of, you know, how to identify disinformation, and also how to empower people to help other people to rebut disinformation. So responses that are aimed at a target audience. So I think, you know, once we think about this as a balancing act between sort of controlling and regulating information, and at the same time promoting free speech, promoting good journalism, good information on the content, which is also, I think, a very important imperative on the content. So all those imperatives, I think, have to be held in balance, and that is something that, you know, will require some deft footwork in future.
Thanks, Herman. And yeah, thanks again, Ibrahim. That was a really good question. So I'm glad we managed to get it in there. I'm going to pass back now to Lisa and Tucson just to wrap up, say some thank yous. But thanks, everyone. It's been really great. I hope this inspires you to go and read the volume, because there are loads of great contributions, including the people here, but also many, many more. And it's been a real pleasure being part of this. So thank you very much. And over to you guys to wrap up.
Thank you so much, Nick. And thank you really everyone, both for making the time, such a stimulating conversation, and also to the audience for the great questions. As you can see, there's just a great amount of energy, knowledge from across sectors, great deal of experience, and a great sense of urgency around these issues. So there's more coming that way in the booklet, and more interesting pieces. We look forward to you engaging with it, download it, share it in your networks, comments, reach out to us on the social media. And again, I just want to say a big thank you to everyone, and in particular to Nick and Lisa for being such great collaborators. Lisa, do you want to add a few words?
Not much, I guess. I think this conversation mainly showed that the questions that all of you are asking are complex, and that means that also the answers are complex, and there's many layers that we need to look at, and that we need to do research on. And I honestly enjoyed reading all of the contributions, and I look forward to more of your research and to further discussing the issues that we also raised today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Take care, stay safe.